Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a world where justice wasn't just about right or wrong, but about honor, reputation, and the cold, hard reality of vengeance. Imagine this: you're standing on a windswept, treeless plain, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Around you, a rough assembly of grim faced warriors and stoic farmers gathers, their cloaks rustling in the breeze. Axes and swords hang at hips, not just as tools of war, but as symbols of a justice that could be swift and utterly brutal. There are no fancy courthouses, no robed judges, just the gathered community and the weight of their judgment. You probably won't survive this system if you cross the wrong person, but we're going to try to navigate it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the Viking Age, a time roughly from the late 8th to the mid-11th century. This wasn't a monolithic empire with centralized laws enforced by a king's decree. Instead, it was a mosaic of chieftains, clans, and independent communities, each adhering to a complex, largely unwritten code of conduct. This code, sometimes called rhetorite or loglaw, was deeply ingrained in the very fabric of society. It was about maintaining social order. Yes, but more fundamentally, it was about protecting one's honor and the honor of one's family. You quickly learn that disrespect, a slight, a perceived injustice, could escalate faster than a long ship crossing an open sea. The core principle that underpins this entire system, a mainstream historical fact you'll grasp almost immediately, is that Viking Age justice was primarily based on customary law, enforced by the community through local assemblies known as things, and focused heavily on compensation, honor, and the prevention of escalating blood feuds. There was no standing police force, no overarching governmental body to impose decisions. Justice was largely a do-it-yourself affair, or rather a community-enforced affair, where the power rested with the collective. This meant that your standing in the community, your family's strength, and your reputation were just as important as any facts of a case. It's like a small-town meeting where everyone knows everyone else's business, but with much higher stakes, often involving life and limb. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the deeply personal nature of this justice system is the concept of gifting or guesting a problem. If a dispute became too hot to handle locally, or if one party felt they couldn't get a fair hearing, they might travel to another region, often to the thing of a powerful chieftain they trusted, and essentially gift their case to him for arbitration, becoming his temporary guest. Imagine having to travel hundreds of miles just to get a fair shake. Essentially shopping for justice like it's a new axe. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of formalized legal texts in the earliest Viking Age meant that justice was truly arbitrary and depended entirely on the whims of powerful individuals, or if there was a strong, consistent oral tradition of legal precedent and customary law that provided a surprising degree of fairness and predictability within communities. Was it truly chaos, or was there an unwritten order? You notice the air is charged not with the formality of a modern court, but with a palpable tension. Everyone present has a stake, either directly in a dispute or indirectly, as members of a community where order is paramount. The law isn't a separate entity. It's woven into the very fabric of their lives, lived and breathed by every free person. You could be called upon as a witness or as a supporter for a kinsman. Your word, your oath, carried immense weight. The ultimate goal of this system often wasn't punishment in the modern sense, but resolution. Violence was a constant threat, and unresolved grievances could easily spiral into generations-long blood feuds. So the thing, this assembly of free men, was designed to mediate, to arbitrate, and to offer solutions that, while sometimes harsh, aim to restore a fragile peace. But make no mistake, beneath the surface of these seemingly orderly proceedings lay the ever-present threat of violence, of personal retribution, if the outcome wasn't deemed satisfactory. Your survival here depends less on knowing written laws and more on understanding the unspoken rules of honor, loyalty, and the delicate balance of power within the community. And you better believe that everyone around you understands these rules perfectly. The heart of Viking Age justice, the very place where disputes were aired and decisions rendered, was the Thing People's Court. Imagine a natural amphitheater, perhaps a flat, open field marked by sacred stones, or a specially designated mound. It's here, beneath the vast, open sky, that free men and sometimes women in specific roles would gather periodically to make laws, discuss community affairs, and, crucially, to settle grievances. This wasn't a king's court, it was a gathering of the people, for the people, and by the people, embodying a deeply democratic, if brutal, spirit. You feel the weight of countless generations of tradition in the very air of this place. As you approach the Thing site, you see families arriving from all directions, some having traveled for days across rugged terrain. They bring their tents, their provisions, and their grievances. The atmosphere isn't solemn in the way a modern courtroom might be. It's a bustling, almost festive gathering, a social event where alliances are reinforced, news is exchanged, and even marriages might be arranged. But beneath this surface of communal activity, a serious purpose underlies everything. One mainstream historical fact is that the Thing was the central legal and political assembly in Viking Age society, where all free men had the right to attend, voice their opinions, and participate in the making and upholding of laws, making it a cornerstone of their decentralized governance. It was a truly remarkable system for its time, granting ordinary individuals a direct say in their collective fate. You might notice a raised platform or a circle of stones, designated as the Logreta Law Rock or Law Assembly, where the most important pronouncements were made. Standing upon it would be the Logsogumater Law Speaker, a respected individual chosen for their vast memory and knowledge of the law. They weren't a judge in the modern sense, but a living repository of the community's legal traditions. Think of them as the human embodiment of their entire legal code, walking and talking, which is a pretty cool, if incredibly high-pressure, job. A particularly quirky tidbit about the Thing is that due to the lack of written laws in many early Viking societies, the law speaker would literally recite the laws from memory over a period of days, acting as the community's collective memory. Imagine trying to run a legal system where the entire statute book is stored in one person's brain, prone to human error, forgetfulness, or even strategic omissions. Historians still argue whether the oral nature of these laws made them more adaptable and responsive to changing circumstances within communities, or if it made them more susceptible to manipulation by powerful individuals who could claim to remember the law in a way that suited their interests. Did it offer flexibility or invite corruption? When a case was brought before the Thing, it wasn't presented by lawyers. Instead, the injured party or their representative from their kindred family group would formally state their grievance. The accused would then have the opportunity to respond. Witnesses would be called, not necessarily to give evidence as we understand it, but often to swear oaths affirming their support for one party or the other, or to vouch for a person's character. Reputation and the standing of your family were incredibly important. If your family was numerous and respected, their support could swing a verdict. The decision-making process was less about logical argument and more about communal consensus. After both sides had presented their case, the Thing members, the free men gathered, would collectively weigh the arguments, the oaths, and the reputations involved. Their collective judgment, expressed through acclamation or murmurs, would determine the outcome. It wasn't always fair, not by modern standards, and bias could certainly creep in. But it was the system they had, and it was deeply rooted in their cultural values. The Thing's power lay not in enforcing its decisions through a standing army, but through the moral and social pressure of the entire community. A judgment rendered at the thing carried immense weight, and to defy it was to defy the collective will of your peers, a potentially devastating blow to your honor and your family's standing. You feel the collective gaze of the assembled free men, a silent pressure that could be far more powerful than any armed guard. It was in this open air among the people that the brutal but often effective gears of Viking justice slowly turned. Even when disputes were brought before the thing, the goal wasn't always a dramatic declaration of guilt or innocence followed by harsh imprisonment. More often, the brutal justice of the Viking Age sought to restore balance through a system of compensation known as vergild blood price paid. This wasn't about vengeance in its purest, most destructive form. It was about preventing unending cycles of retribution by assigning a monetary value to every injury, every loss, and even every life. It's like a meticulously calculated insurance policy for violence, where every broken bone or lost life has a specific, negotiable price tag. You hear the details of a dispute being aired, perhaps a quarrel over cattle that escalated into a violent assault, or even a fatal blow struck in a drunken brawl. Instead of demanding a life for a life, the thing might rule that a specific payment be made. One mainstream historical fact is that the concept of vergild, literally man payment, was central to Viking Age legal systems, where financial compensation was established for various crimes, from insults and minor injuries to murder, with specific amounts set for different social statuses and types of harm. This system aimed to prevent blood feuds and maintain peace within communities by providing an alternative to endless cycles of retaliatory violence. The value of the vergild depended on the severity of the crime and, crucially, on the social standing of the injured party. A free man's life was worth more than a thrall's and enslaved person, and a chieftain's life was worth more than a farmer's. Even specific injuries had their own price: a missing tooth, a severed finger, a blinded eye. Each had an agreed-upon compensation amount. A quirky tidbit is that sagas sometimes detail the exact finger guild or eye guild paid for specific injuries, a grimly practical approach to bodily harm. Imagine having a detailed price list for every possible injury your body could sustain. Historians still argue whether the vergild system truly fostered peace by providing a clear legal framework for compensation, or if it merely legalized a form of class distinction, allowing the wealthy to literally buy their way out of physical retribution for severe crimes. Did it promote order or just entrench inequality? You might witness the aggrieved party, or their family, calculating the exact amount of silver or goods owed. This wasn't just a simple payment, it was a deeply symbolic act. Accepting the vergild meant that the injured party, or the victim's family, formally renounced their right to vengeance. To refuse the vergild was a grave statement, signaling an intent to pursue a blood feud, a path fraught with danger for all involved. You can feel the tension in the air as the offer is made and considered, knowing that the acceptance or rejection of this payment could determine the fate of entire families. The payment itself wasn't always in coins. In a society where coinage could be scarce, vergild might be paid in silver arm rings, livestock, valuable furs, woven cloth, or even land. The process of gathering this compensation could be a heavy burden on the offender and their family, sometimes forcing them into debt or even temporary servitude. But it was often preferable to the alternative, a lifelong blood feud that could decimate kindreds. For murder, the vergild was the highest. If the killer was unable or unwilling to pay, or if the victim's family refused the payment, then the cycle of violence was almost inevitable. However, the very existence of the vergild system shows a strong underlying desire for resolution and social stability. Even in a society famed for its warriors, it highlighted a practical, if brutal, understanding that unending revenge destroyed communities. This system was an early form of restorative justice, aiming to bring balance back to the community after a wrong had been committed. It wasn't about punishing the individual through imprisonment, a rare concept in the Viking Age, or execution, reserved for only the most egregious crimes against the community. or acts of witchcraft. It was about acknowledging harm, valuing human life even with differing price tags, and providing a pathway, however fraught, to peace. And as you watch a dispute slowly unwind into a negotiated payment, you realize that even in this fierce age, there was a profound understanding that sometimes the price of peace, though paid in blood money, was worth more than endless conflict. When disputes could not be settled by compensation alone, or when the truth of a matter was unclear. The brutal justice system of the Viking Age often turned to higher powers through oaths and ordeals, divine judgment. Without modern forensic science or complex investigative techniques, proving guilt or innocence was often a matter of reputation, community belief, and a desperate plea to the gods to reveal the truth. These were not trials of evidence as you know them, but trials of faith and endurance, where the outcome was believed to be dictated by supernatural forces. It's like throwing dice but believing that the gods themselves are controlling the fall of the cubes, and your life depends on it. You might witness a solemn gathering at the Thing, or in a more private setting, where an individual accused of a crime, or a plaintiff seeking to prove a claim, is about to undergo an ordeal. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking Age justice frequently employed judicial ordeals, such as trial by hot iron or hot water, and relied heavily on the swearing of solemn, legally binding oaths as methods to ascertain guilt or innocence through a perceived intervention of divine judgment. These practices reflected a deep belief that the gods, or later the Christian God, would reveal the truth to the innocent and condemn the guilty. The swearing of an oath was not a trivial matter. An oath taken on sacred rings often kept at the Thing site, on holy objects, or even on a spear was considered a profound commitment, binding the individual to their word before the gods. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of oath helpers. These weren't witnesses to a crime, but individuals who would swear an oath that the accused's oath was true, effectively vouching for their character and credibility. The more respectable oath helpers an accused could muster, the stronger their case. Imagine needing a dozen friends to swear you're trustworthy. Rather than just testifying to what they saw, historians still argue whether the system of oath helpers, by requiring a person to have a strong network of trustworthy supporters, inadvertently encouraged moral behavior and community cohesion, or if it simply entrenched existing power structures, making it harder for those without influential connections to clear their name. Did it promote honesty or social leverage? If an oath alone wasn't enough, or if the crime was particularly heinous, an ordeal might be ordered. You might see the preparations for an ordeal by hot iron. A piece of iron, perhaps a plowshare or a simple bar, would be heated to a glowing red. The accused would then have to carry this hot iron for a specified distance, perhaps 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was a sign of innocence. If it festered, it was a sign of guilt. The terror in the accused's eyes as they faced this fiery test is palpable. Another common ordeal was by hot water. The accused would plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve an object. And again, the healing of the wound would determine their fate. For accusations of a less severe nature, an ordeal by cold water might be used. The accused, bound, would be thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were considered innocent as the pure water accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty as the pure water rejected them. The perverse logic of these tests, designed to be almost impossible to pass unscathed, highlights the desperation for divine intervention. The belief underpinning these ordeals was absolute. The gods would not allow an innocent person to suffer permanent harm, or would miraculously heal their wounds, or make them sink correctly. Conversely, a guilty person would be revealed through their suffering or by being rejected by the element. You watch as a man carefully prepares for the ordeal, his face a mask of stoicism, but his trembling hands betraying his terror. The tension during these events is immense. The community gathers, silent and watchful, believing they are witnessing a direct interaction with the divine. The outcome of an ordeal was considered indisputable, a judgment from powers far greater than any chieftain or thing assembly. It bypassed the need for complex arguments or conflicting testimonies, offering a stark, binary truth. For those who believed, it was a comforting affirmation of cosmic justice. For the accused, it was a terrifying gamble with their life and their soul, where their own fear and pain were the instruments of their supposed truth. And as you witness the smoke from the hot iron curling into the sky, you realize that in this brutal system, the gods themselves were the ultimate arbiters of your fate. If you were deemed guilty of a serious crime, particularly one that offended the very fabric of the community, the brutal justice system of the Viking Age had a punishment far worse than death for many outlawry: living death sentence. This wasn't imprisonment, which was largely unknown. It was a societal excommunication, a legal banishment that stripped you of all rights and protections, forcing you to exist outside the law, a ghost in your own land. It's like being erased from existence, a social and legal annihilation where your very breath becomes a crime. You hear the solemn, chilling pronouncement at the thing skoganger, forest-going or outlawry. This was typically reserved for crimes like murder without a Vergild settlement, egregious theft, or repeated offenses that demonstrated an utter disregard for communal norms. One mainstream historical fact is that outlawry was one of the most severe punishments in the Viking Age, rendering an individual a wolf in holy places, meaning anyone could kill them without legal consequence, and denying them all legal protection, property rights, and social standing. It was a truly terrifying fate, akin to a social and legal execution. Imagine the sudden, profound silence that follows such a pronouncement. Your kinsmen, who stood by you during the thing, now turn away, their faces a mixture of sorrow and grim acceptance. To aid an outlaw was to become an outlaw yourself, your property, your land. Your very name might be declared forfeit. You become a non-person, a walking target. A particularly quirky tidbit related to outlawry is that, in some interpretations, an outlaw was literally considered less than human, equated with wild animals. This meant that any legal or social obligation owed to a person simply ceased to exist for an outlaw. Imagine being legally categorized as a dangerous beast, fair game for anyone with a weapon. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of outlawry was to deter crime through extreme social shame and physical danger, or if it also served a practical function by removing disruptive individuals from the community in a way that avoided the messy complications and moral dilemmas of capital punishment. Was it primarily a deterrent or a convenient disposal mechanism? You are cast out, stripped of your identity and your safety net, the familiar roads, the welcoming hearths, the very boundaries of your community become hostile territory. Every stranger is a potential killer. Every rustle in the woods a threat. You cannot appeal to the thing, for you are no longer a part of it. You cannot seek Vergild for any injury, for you have no legal standing. Your very existence is now a crime punishable by death, at anyone's hand, without consequence. Survival as an outlaw was an immense challenge. You would have to live off the land, foraging for food, sheltering in caves or hidden groves, constantly vigilant. The winter. Remember that fierce cold. It would be your most relentless enemy. Without a warm hearth or shelter, you would live in constant fear of discovery, either by those seeking vengeance or by opportunistic individuals looking to gain favor by bringing in an outlaw's head. Some outlaws became desperate brigands, preying on travelers, becoming the very criminals they were accused of being. Others simply vanished into the vast, untamed wilderness, succumbing to starvation, exposure, or the blades of those who found them. There were stories, of course, of outlaws who somehow survived for years, becoming legendary figures, but these were the rare exceptions, figures of awe and dread. The severity of outlawry underscored the Viking Age's emphasis on community and social cohesion. To be cast out was to lose everything that made life meaningful: your family, your honor, your very place in the world. It was a punishment that leveraged the deep-seated human need for belonging, turning it into a weapon of social destruction. You feel the cold wind on your face, the vast, unforgiving landscape stretching before you, and you realize that every step you take as an outlaw is a step further into a living nightmare, where the only justice is the sharp edge of a blade and the unforgiving embrace of the wild. Even with the Thing seeking resolution and the possibility of Vergild, the brutal reality of Viking Age justice meant that not all disputes could be contained or settled peacefully. When a formal agreement failed, or when honor was perceived to be irrevocably stained, the terrifying cycle of blood-feud cycles of vengeance could erupt, engulfing families and entire communities in generations of retaliatory violence. This wasn't just individual anger, it was a societal scourge, a devastating chain reaction where every act of aggression demanded a counteract, often spiraling into endless bloodshed. It's like a wildfire that, once sparked, consumes everything in its path, leaving only scorched earth and bitter memories. You witness the aftermath of a dispute at the Thing that failed to reach a resolution. Perhaps one party refused the Vergild, or perhaps the perceived insult was so profound that no amount of silver could wipe it clean. The air crackles with unspoken threats. The two families, or kindreds, glare at each other, their faces grim, their hands resting on sword hilts. One mainstream historical fact is that blood feuds were a prevalent and recognized, albeit destructive, aspect of Viking Age society, where unresolved grievances, particularly those involving death or grave dishonor, could escalate into prolonged cycles of retaliatory violence between families or clans. While the legal system aimed to prevent them, feuds often arose when legal avenues failed or were deemed insufficient to restore honor. The concept of honor, or drotten, was paramount. A slight against one member of a kindred was a slight against all. To allow an insult or an injury to go unavenged was to lose face, to diminish your family's standing, and to invite further aggression. This intense focus on collective honor made it nearly impossible to back down once a feud had been declared. It was a matter of reputation, of standing, of your very identity within the community. Imagine having to risk your life, and the lives of your loved ones, just to prove you weren't a coward. A particularly quirky tidbit is the intricate web of kinship that could draw surprising individuals into a blood feud. Distant cousins, marriage alliances, even foster families could find themselves dragged into a conflict, compelled by bonds of loyalty and honor. It wasn't just direct family members. Anyone connected by blood or oath could become fair game. Imagine discovering that your great-aunt's third cousin's unfortunate run-in at the market means you now have to sharpen your axe. Historians still argue whether the threat of a blood feud, by making violence a potentially disastrous outcome for all parties, sometimes encouraged peaceful arbitration and the acceptance of Vergild, or if the deeply ingrained honor culture meant that feuds were an almost inevitable expression of social hierarchy and individual pride, regardless of legal mechanisms. Did it serve as a deterrent or an unavoidable consequence? Once a blood feud began, there were often no clear rules, only cycles of vengeance. An act of violence from one side would be met with a retaliatory act from the other, often escalating in severity. A single murder could lead to multiple killings, burning of homes, cattle raids, and the systematic decimation of both kindreds. The goal was to inflict damage, to diminish the other side's strength and honor, until one side was either annihilated or utterly broken and forced to submit, often fleeing as outlaws. You might hear chilling sagas of feuds that lasted for generations, passed down through oral tradition, their stories serving as both cautionary tales and justifications for continued violence. Families lived in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, knowing that an attack could come at any time, from any direction. Sleep became a luxury, and vigilance a necessity. The Thing, despite its attempts at mediation, could do little once a feud had truly erupted. Its power was in preventing feuds, not necessarily in stopping them once they had gained momentum. Sometimes, a powerful chieftain or king might intervene, attempting to force a settlement, but often this came only after immense bloodshed. The community itself would suffer, its resources drained, its stability shattered by the internal conflict. You feel the tension in the air, a silent weight that presses down on the entire community. The grim faces of the men, the anxious glances of the women, all speak of the ever-present threat. For you, merely being allied with one family or another could suddenly make you a target. Your very survival in this brutal justice system means understanding that sometimes the law of the axe, driven by cycles of vengeance, overshadows all other forms of justice, demanding a price that only blood can pay. In a world where laws were largely unwritten and justice was dispensed by communal consensus, the role of those who knew the law, the Viking lawmen bearers of Lormut, was absolutely critical. These weren't judges in robes, perched on high benches. They were living libraries of legal tradition, memorizing vast amounts of customary law and precedent, and serving as the guiding voices at the Thing. You witnessed their presence at the assembly, their voices calm and authoritative amidst the clamor, their words carrying the weight of generations of tradition. It's like having the entire legal code of a nation stored in the mind of one person, their every utterance shaping the future of disputes. The most prominent of these figures was the Lögzogumadur, or law speaker, particularly in Iceland and Norway. This individual was elected or chosen for a specific term, and their primary duty was to recite the laws aloud at the annual Thing, ensuring that everyone present understood the legal framework governing their society. One mainstream historical fact is that the law speaker Lögzogumadur was a highly respected and essential figure in Viking Age legal assemblies, responsible for memorizing and orally reciting the vast body of customary laws, acting as the living embodiment of the legal code in societies without formal written law. Their memory and integrity were paramount to the functioning of the justice system. Imagine the sheer mental discipline required for such a task. These law speakers didn't just understand the law, they were the law, capable of reciting intricate rules, precedents, and compensation amounts for a myriad of offenses. A particularly quirky tidbit is that the law speaker often had a specialized staff or rod, not just as a symbol of office, but sometimes used to mark the Logreta law rock or to keep order during the assembly. This physical object served as a focal point for the oral transmission of law. Imagine a society where the entire legal system could vanish if one person simply forgot. Historians still argue whether the reliance on oral transmission made Viking Age law inherently more flexible and adaptable to local conditions, allowing for nuanced interpretations and evolution over time, or if it made the system vulnerable to inconsistencies, disputes over interpretation, and the potential for powerful individuals to manipulate the law through selective memory. Did it promote organic growth or invite arbitrary power? You observe the law speaker at the Thing, his voice clear and resonant, even against the wind. He doesn't interpret in the modern sense, he states the law, and then the community applies it to the facts of the case, guided by his recitation. He is a guide, a facilitator, but ultimately the judgment rests with the free men assembled. His authority comes from his knowledge and the community's trust in his memory and impartiality. Beyond the law speaker, there were other figures who held legal knowledge. Respected chieftains or prominent farmers, often called godar in Iceland, also possessed a deep understanding of the law, passed down through their families. They would advise their kinsmen, represent their interests at the Thing, and help mediate disputes. Their influence was often as much about their social standing and their ability to rally support as it was about their pure legal knowledge. The training of a law speaker was a lifelong endeavor, beginning in childhood, absorbing the vast oral traditions, listening to elders, and participating in countless things. It was a rigorous apprenticeship of the mind, crucial for maintaining social order. For a crime, the law speaker would lay out the relevant legal principles, and the thing members would then decide if the accused's actions fell within or outside those bounds. The concept of proof was often tied to these lawmen. If a statement of fact was challenged, the law speaker might oversee an oath swearing, ensuring it was done correctly and that the correct oath helpers were present. The lawman's presence lent legitimacy to the proceedings, providing an anchor of tradition and continuity in a society without written statutes. You listen closely as the law speaker articulates the nuances of a particularly complex land dispute, his words painting a vivid picture of customary boundaries and ancient agreements. You realize that these individuals, the bearers of lore, were the true backbone of Viking justice. They ensured that even in a brutal world of personal honor and potential vengeance, there was a shared understanding of right and wrong, a framework that, however rough-hewn, allowed communities to function. Their memory was their power, and their power was the law itself. In a justice system that lacked modern forensic techniques, the outcome of a dispute at the Thing often hinged on more intangible qualities. Evidence and witnesses' reputation matters. It wasn't about blood spatter patterns or fingerprint analysis. Instead, the weight of testimony, the credibility of an individual, and the collective perception of a person's standing within the community often carried far more sway than any purely factual account. You learn quickly that, in this world, what people think of you and who stands by your side can make the difference between freedom and outlawry. It's like a courtroom where the jury already knows everyone's family history and personal quirks, and that knowledge colors every piece of testimony. When a claim was brought forward, the presentation of evidence was often a highly personal affair. You might see the accuser detailing their grievance with passionate, rhetorical flourishes, attempting to sway the Thing members through persuasive speech. The accused would respond in kind, denying the charges or offering counter-arguments. One mainstream historical fact is that Viking Age legal proceedings relied heavily on oral testimony, oaths, and the public reputation of individuals and their families, rather than physical evidence or professional legal representation. A person's social standing and the strength of their kinship network were crucial factors in the perceived credibility of their claims or denials. Witnesses were indeed called, but their role was often different from what you might expect. They weren't just there to recount what they saw. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of witnesses to the oath or oath helpers, which we touched on before. These individuals weren't necessarily present at the time of the alleged crime. Instead, they swore an oath that they believed the accused's oath of innocence to be true. Their testimony was about character and trustworthiness, not factual observation. Imagine trying to prove you didn't steal a cow, and your defense is simply getting a dozen respectable people to swear that you're too honorable to steal. Historians still argue whether the reliance on oath helpers, by requiring individuals to cultivate a good reputation and strong social ties, inherently promoted a more ethical and accountable community, or if it simply made it easier for well-connected individuals to escape justice while marginalizing those without a strong social network. Did it encourage virtue or simply reinforce social stratification? Your own reputation, or era, was your most valuable asset. If you were known as an honest, honorable, and upright person, your word carried weight. If you had a history of deceit, cowardice, or disrespecting community norms, your claims would be met with skepticism. This meant that maintaining your honor was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for survival in the legal system. A single act of public dishonor could cripple your ability to gain support or be believed at the Thing. The Thing itself, as a gathering of the community, already had a collective understanding of most individuals' reputations. People knew each other's families, their histories, their feuds, and their virtues. This intimate knowledge meant that a skillful orator could paint a compelling picture. But it was a picture painted on a canvas of pre-existing perceptions. Physical evidence, like a stolen item or a weapon, might be presented, but its interpretation would still often rely on verbal testimony and the reputation of those presenting it. There was no concept of forensic analysis. The weight given to such items was less about scientific proof and more about their symbolic power in illustrating a narrative. The informal nature of the proceedings also meant that emotional appeals and personal attacks could play a significant role. A particularly persuasive speaker, even if their facts were shaky, could sway the collective opinion of the thing. The pressure to conform to group consensus was strong, and dissenting voices might find themselves isolated. You observe the subtle cues, the nods of agreement from certain influential figures, the shifting gazes, the murmurs among the crowd. You learn that in this court of public opinion, where formal rules of evidence are absent, your survival depends on how well you cultivate your kindred and your own personal standing. For in the brutal justice of the Viking Age, it is not just what you say, but who you are and who stands with you that truly matters. And in the silent judgment of the gathered free men, your very fate is being weighed. When words, oaths, or even the judgment of the thing proved insufficient, or when a dispute was deemed beyond the realm of communal arbitration, the brutal justice of the Viking Age offered a stark and violent alternative: duels and holmgang trial by combat. This wasn't a last resort in the modern sense. For certain offenses, particularly those touching upon profound honor or difficult-to-prove accusations, it was a legitimate, legally sanctioned method for two individuals to settle their dispute with weapons. Believing that the gods would grant victory to the righteous? It's like a courtroom where the final verdict is delivered not by a gavel, but by the clash of steel, with your life on the line. You hear the challenge issued, perhaps for a grave insult, an accusation of cowardice, or a claim of land ownership. A man's honor, his era, was so vital that sometimes only a physical confrontation could restore it. One mainstream historical fact is that the holmgang, a formalized duel, was a legally recognized method of dispute resolution in the Viking Age, particularly in Scandinavia and Iceland, allowing individuals to settle serious grievances through single combat, with the victor legally recognized as in the right. It was a ritualized form of violence, designed to prevent larger-scale blood feuds by localizing the conflict to two individuals. The rules of the holmgang could vary. It typically took place on a designated, often marked-out piece of ground, a holm or small island, hence the name, though it could be any isolated spot, bound by specific rules to ensure fairness, at least in theory. A quirky tidbit is that the combatants might wear limited armor, or sometimes none at all, and a cloak was often laid down within the boundaries, stepping outside of which could mean forfeiture or a blow from the opponent. Imagine fighting for your life within a tiny, marked-off area, with strict rules about where you could step. Historians still argue whether the holmgang, despite its obvious brutality, served as a genuinely effective deterrent against frivolous challenges or exaggerated insults by making the consequences so severe, or if it merely formalized violence as a legitimate means of acquiring wealth and power by forcing the weaker party to submit or die. Did it promote honest discourse or merely empower the physically strongest? You might witness the preparations. The combatants would strip to their fighting gear, perhaps donning a helmet and shield, or sometimes even fighting mostly unarmored. Weapons were typically swords, axes, or spears. The duel wasn't necessarily to the death, though it often ended that way. The fight might conclude when one party was wounded and unable to continue, or when they conceded defeat, acknowledged their wrong, or were willing to pay the required compensation. But a fatal blow was always a grim possibility, often encouraged by the gravity of the insult. The audience, if present, would be silent and watchful, knowing that they were witnessing a direct form of justice. There would be no interference, no cheering, just the grim tension of two men fighting for their honor, their reputation, and potentially their lives. The law speaker or other respected figures might be present to ensure the rules of the holmgang were upheld. For those who lost, the consequences were dire. If you lost the holmgang but survived, you might be required to pay a hefty fine, forfeit property, or suffer permanent dishonor. making you a social outcast. If you died, your family might not be able to claim Vergild for your death, as it was a sanctioned duel. For the victor, honor was restored, and their claim or innocence was definitively established. It was a clear, unambiguous resolution, achieved through raw strength and skill. The very existence of the holmgang underscores the emphasis on personal honor and physical prowess in Viking society. It was a world where a man's word and his ability to defend it with his blade were inextricably linked. It was a system that, in its most extreme form, bypassed the need for complex legal arguments and went straight to the heart of perceived truth, trusting in the judgment of battle. And as you hear the ring of steel on steel, the grunt of effort, and perhaps a cry of pain, you realize that in this brutal justice system, sometimes, the only way to prove your innocence or claim your right was to fight for it with every fiber of your being, leaving the ultimate verdict to the gods and the sharp edge of a blade. Even with the individual conflicts and the terrifying prospects of outlawry or holmgang, the things authority justices reach extended beyond mere dispute resolution. This communal assembly was the supreme governing body, its power deriving not from a king's decree, but from the collective will and participation of all free men. It was the bedrock of order in a decentralized society, capable of binding communities to its decisions and shaping the very structure of Viking life. You realize that its reach permeated every aspect of existence, from the highest chieftain to the lowliest farmer. It's like a massive open-air parliament that also functions as the highest court, its pronouncements carrying the weight of collective destiny. You've already seen how the Thing could resolve disputes and issue pronouncements of outlawry. But its authority went further. It was at the Thing that laws were made, or rather declared and upheld. While many laws were customary, the Thing could adapt them, codify them, or introduce new rules governing everything from land inheritance to trade. One mainstream historical fact is that the Thing functioned not only as a judicial court but also as a legislative body, with the power to establish and enforce laws or log that were binding on all members of the community or regional confederation. This legislative function was crucial for adapting to changing circumstances and maintaining social order in a dynamic society. Imagine the discussions that might take place. Perhaps a new dispute over fishing rights has arisen, or a long-standing custom needs clarification. The law speaker would recite the relevant existing lore, and then free men would debate, argue, and ultimately decide on a new interpretation or a specific ruling that would then become binding precedent. This wasn't a quick process. Deliberations could take days, fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the legal framework. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of thing peace, or assembly peace. During the period of the Thing, all attendees were considered to be under a special peace. Any act of violence or dispute within the Thing site was considered a grievous offense, far worse than if it occurred elsewhere, and would be met with immediate and severe punishment. Imagine a place where, despite the swords at everyone's hips, an unspoken, sacred truce held sway. At least for the duration of the assembly, historians still argue whether the concept of Thing peace was primarily a practical measure to ensure the smooth functioning of the assembly by preventing internal feuds, or if it had deeper, almost religious significance, reflecting a sacred space where the community, guided by the gods, transcended ordinary human conflict. Was it pragmatic or spiritual? The Thing also had the authority to formalize agreements and settle large-scale disputes between powerful chieftains or clans, preventing wider conflict. It could levy fines, confiscate property, and even, in the most extreme cases of rebellion against the community's will, condemn individuals to death for acts like treason or repeated, unrepentant violations of the peace. While rare, such executions, often by hanging or drowning, were acts of communal judgment against those who truly threatened the social order. For the ordinary free man, participating in the Thing was not just a right but a civic duty. Your presence lent legitimacy to its decisions. Your voice, however humble, contributed to the collective will. This active participation fostered a strong sense of ownership over the legal system, making it truly their law, not something imposed by a distant ruler. It's why defiance of the thing's judgment, as an outlawry, was so devastating. It was a defiance of the entire community. The geographical reach of a thing's authority varied. Some were local, serving a single fjord or valley. Others, like the Althing in Iceland, gathered representatives from across an entire island, creating a truly national legal and legislative body. This tiered system of things allowed for both local autonomy and broader, unified governance. You feel the palpable force of collective will when a judgment is pronounced, the murmurs of agreement, the solemn nods. This wasn't just a group of men arguing, it was the embodiment of Viking justice in action, its reach extending into every home, every field, every longship. The thing's authority, though unwritten in scrolls, was carved into the very landscape and the very lives of those who gathered beneath the open sky, binding them together in a brutal yet effective framework of law. It was their ultimate expression of collective power and their enduring symbol of justice. In a society often romanticized for its warriors and explorers, it's easy to overlook the nuances of legal standing for all members, particularly the less powerful. For women in the Viking Age, their position within this brutal justice system was complex. Women's legal standing limited rights. While they certainly weren't without agency or influence, their legal rights were distinct from, and often subordinate to, those of men. Especially when it came to public legal forms like the Thing, it's like being allowed into the court, but only to listen from the gallery, not to speak from the podium, unless under very specific circumstances. You observe the Thing. While you see women present, they are primarily observers, tending to family matters, exchanging news, or perhaps overseeing trade. They do not, as a rule, participate directly in the legal debates or decisions of the Thing itself. Their voices in the formal legal process were largely mediated through their male relatives. One mainstream historical fact is that while Viking Age women held more rights and autonomy than many of their contemporaries in other European societies, including property ownership and the right to divorce, they were generally excluded from formal legal and political participation in public assemblies like the Thing. Their legal agency often operated within the domestic sphere or through male representatives. However, this doesn't mean they were completely powerless. A particularly quirky tidbit is that women could, and often did, initiate legal proceedings through their male guardians or kinsmen. A woman could demand a divorce, reclaim her dowry, or seek justice for a sexual assault, but she would typically need a man to formally present her case at the Thing. Imagine having a strong, unyielding will, but always needing to use someone else's voice to express it legally. Historians still argue whether the de facto influence of women within their households and kin groups, through their control of resources and their social standing, often circumvented or mitigated the de jure limitations on their public legal participation, making their true power far greater than the written or unwritten laws suggest. Did their domestic power compensate for their public exclusion? Or was their exclusion a fundamental limitation? A woman's rights were often tied to her marital status and her family. An unmarried woman remained under the guardianship of her father or brother. Upon marriage, her guardianship typically transferred to her husband. Yet, she usually retained ownership of her dowry and bridal gift, which gave her significant economic leverage. If a husband mistreated his wife, or failed in his marital duties, she could, with the support of her family, demand a divorce. This was a progressive right compared to many other contemporary cultures. In cases of a husband's impotency, public humiliation, or even simply long absences, a woman could seek to end the marriage. The legal process for divorce, while still requiring male representation at the Thing, was a clear pathway to autonomy. If a divorce was granted, she would typically reclaim her dowry, ensuring her economic independence. This ability to separate and reclaim property was a powerful tool in a woman's arsenal, allowing her to escape intolerable situations. However, when it came to violence against women, the legal remedies could be more brutal. Rape was a serious offense, often punishable by outlawry or a substantial vergild, but the burden of proof often lay heavily on the victim, and her reputation was crucial. If a woman was a thrall enslaved, her legal protections were minimal to non-existent, and she could be subjected to sexual exploitation with little or no legal recourse. Women also played a vital role in maintaining the family's honor. Remember blood feuds. A woman's perceived dishonor could spark a feud, and a woman could also be instrumental in resolving one, often through strategic marriages or by advocating for a weregild settlement. Their influence, though often behind the scenes, was immense. You watch as a determined-looking woman, veiled and accompanied by her stern-faced brother, approaches the Logretta. Her brother speaks on her behalf, detailing a grievance against her estranged husband. You realize that while her voice isn't heard directly in the formal proceedings, her will, her complaint, and her family's support are undeniably present, shaping the discourse. In this brutal justice system, women's rights were circumscribed by their gender, but their social standing, their economic power, and the unwavering support of their kindred provided them with a unique, if sometimes hidden form of power that they wielded with strategic precision. While the Viking Age justice system offered complex rules and a degree of participation for free men, and even indirectly, for women, there was one segment of society for whom these protections were largely non-existent: slavery's shadow thrall's justice. The concept of human chattel, the thrall Old Norse for slave, was deeply ingrained in Viking society. And for these unfortunate individuals, the brutal justice system offered almost no recourse, only arbitrary power at the whim of their owners. You see them everywhere, toiling silently, their lives utterly dependent on the mercy or lack thereof of their masters. It's like living under a permanent, suffocating shadow where the very concept of rights simply doesn't apply to you. You might encounter thralls captured during raids, or individuals who sold themselves or their children into bondage during times of famine, or even those born into slavery from thrall parents. Their lives are harsh, filled with unremitting labor. They cultivate fields, tend livestock, perform domestic chores, and sometimes even accompany their masters on voyages or into battle, though rarely as free warriors. One mainstream historical fact is that slavery thraldom was a fundamental institution in Viking Age society. With thralls having virtually no legal rights or protections, their lives and bodies considered the property of their owners, who held near absolute power over them. They were goods, not people. In the eyes of the law, imagine the stark contrast at the thing. Free men debate and defend their honor, their very lives protected by an intricate system of vergild and oaths. But for a thrall, a blow, an injury, or even death inflicted by their owner would likely go unpunished. There was no thing where a thrall could bring a grievance against their master. Their testimony was often considered unreliable in legal proceedings, unless it was supported by the oath of a free man. A particularly quirky tidbit is that while a free man's life had a specific weregild, a thrall's value was simply their market price. Imagine your life being valued no differently than a cow or a hammer. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of slavery in Viking society fundamentally undermined any claims of their legal system being democratic or fair, or if the existence of slavery was simply a common feature of nearly all societies of that era, and thus not a unique failing of the Viking legal structure. Did it negate their claims of justice, or was it simply an accepted norm of the time? You witness a master roughly striking a thrall for a perceived laziness, and there is no intervention, no outcry from onlookers. The thrall simply endures it, their face a mask of stoicism. This wasn't considered an illegal act, but simply a master exercising their right over their property. If a thrall was killed by someone other than their owner, the compensation weregild would be paid to the owner, not to the thrall's family, if they even had one. This underscores the legal understanding that thralls were possessions, not individuals with inherent rights. Their ability to escape was minimal. If a thrall ran away and was caught, they could be severely punished, often branded or mutilated to prevent future attempts. Freedom was sometimes granted by a master, either as a reward for loyalty or service, or in a will. This act of manumission was rare, but it offered a tiny glimmer of hope for some. A freed thrall, though still carrying the stigma of their past, would then gain the basic rights of a free person and could participate in the thing. Even violence between thralls was often seen as a master's problem, not a societal one. If one thrall injured another, the masters might simply agree on compensation, or even use it as an opportunity for the thralls to fight each other. The idea of seeking justice for a thrall from a legal authority was almost entirely alien. You feel the palpable sense of hopelessness surrounding the thralls, their movements slower, their expressions more subdued. They are an essential part of the economic engine of Viking society, performing the arduous labor that allowed free individuals to farm, trade, and raid. Yet their contribution came at the cost of their freedom and their legal personhood. In the brutal justice system of the Viking Age, the shadow of slavery was long and dark, a stark reminder that justice, even in its most basic form, was a privilege reserved for the free, and a concept entirely alien to those deemed property. As the Viking Age progresses, you begin to observe a subtle but profound shift in the legal and social landscape Christianity's influence shifting sands. The arrival of the new faith, initially alongside the traditional Norse beliefs, gradually began to challenge and reshape the ancient, brutal justice system you've come to understand. It wasn't a sudden conversion, but a slow, often contentious process where old customs clashed with new doctrines, leading to a fascinating blend of pagan tradition and Christian morality. It's like watching two powerful currents meet in a vast ocean, slowly mingling and altering the flow of everything around them. You recall the prominence of oaths sworn on sacred rings to Norse gods, and the ordeals believed to be guided by divine intervention. But now, you hear references to Christ, to saints, and to the authority of bishops. One mainstream historical fact is that the gradual conversion of Viking societies to Christianity, beginning around the 10th century and becoming widespread by the 11th, profoundly influenced their legal systems, introducing new concepts like divine forgiveness, sin, and eventually written ecclesiastical law, which challenged traditional pagan practices like blood feuds and judicial ordeals. This new faith brought with it a different moral and legal framework. Imagine the tension at the thing when a dispute arises. A traditionalist might argue for a holmgang or a blood feud, clinging to the old ways of honor and vengeance. But a newly converted Christian might argue for reconciliation, for vergild, or even for forgiveness, appealing to the teachings of the Church. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of a baptismal ordeal, where instead of hot iron, the accused might plunge their hand into cold, consecrated water, or swear an oath on a Bible, with the belief that Christian God would reveal the truth. This was an attempt to adapt the existing legal framework to the new religious beliefs. Historians still argue whether the Church's opposition to blood feuds and judicial ordeals was primarily driven by a genuine concern for social stability and a more humane form of justice, or if it was also a strategic move to centralize power away from local chieftains and thing assemblies under the authority of the Church. Did it truly foster a more just society, or was it a power grab? The Church actively preached against blood feuds, advocating for vergild and, more ideally, for forgiveness and reconciliation. They emphasized the concept of individual sin and the importance of confession and penance, rather than just communal honor. This challenged the very foundation of the old honor-based system. Slowly, the idea of vengeance as a moral right began to erode, replaced by the notion that justice could and should be mediated by a higher authority. Written law, a concept largely absent in early Viking societies. also began to gain prominence with the arrival of Christianity. Monasteries became centers of literacy, and scribes began to record laws. Initially religious canons, but eventually secular laws as well. This transition from oral tradition to written codes, while slow, had immense implications for legal consistency and accessibility. Remember the law speaker, the living embodiment of the law. His role began to shift as written legal texts gained authority. The church also introduced the idea of a king's divine right to rule, challenging the decentralized power of local chieftains and thing assemblies. As kings converted, they often adopted Christian legal principles, using them to consolidate their own power and establish more centralized courts, gradually diminishing the autonomy of the local things. This was a long process, taking centuries, but the seeds were sown during the Viking Age. You see a priest, perhaps a foreign missionary or a newly ordained local, standing beside a law speaker at the thing. Their two worlds, pagan and Christian, momentarily converging. The priest might be advocating for a more merciful resolution, or emphasizing the importance of peace over vengeance. The shift is not immediate nor complete, but the sands are undeniably shifting. The old gods, though still revered by some, are slowly giving way to a new deity, and with him comes a new understanding of sin, justice, and the very nature of law. This slow, often painful transformation lays the groundwork for the more formal, codified legal systems that would emerge in Scandinavia in the centuries to come, moving from the raw yet brutal justice of the axe to a justice administered by parchment and the cross. Having seen the foundations of Viking justice, from the thing to Vergild, and the slow creep of Christian influence, you now arrive at the sharp end of the system punishment's public humiliation. While the Viking Age rarely employed imprisonment as a form of punishment, and execution was reserved for the gravest offenses, their justice system was far from lenient. Instead, it favored methods that reinforced social norms, exacted public shaming, and in some cases involved brutal physical penalties designed to serve as stark warnings to the community. It's like a theatrical performance of justice, where the stage is the village square and the star is the person being punished, all for everyone to see. You might witness a man, perhaps caught stealing a sheep or failing to pay a debt, being subjected to a public shaming. One mainstream historical fact is that public shaming and the imposition of fines vergild were the most common forms of punishment in the Viking Age. While physical mutilation and execution were reserved for severe, unpardonable crimes like repeat offenses, treason, or witchcraft, the goal was often to reintegrate offenders by correcting their behavior, or to remove them if they proved incorrigible. Imagine the shame of being bound to a post in the thing site, or in the village square, for a specified period. People would walk by, pointing, whispering, perhaps even jeering. This public display of dishonor was a powerful deterrent in a society where reputation was everything. A man's era honor was his most valuable possession, and to have it publicly stripped away was a devastating blow, often more feared than physical pain. A quirky tidbit is that in some communities, minor offenders might be forced to wear a specific, embarrassing item of clothing or symbol, making their transgression visible to all. Imagine having to wear a hat shaped like a chicken after stealing one. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on public shaming was a more effective form of social control in a communal society than the abstract concept of imprisonment, or if it simply entrenched social hierarchies and left offenders with an insurmountable burden of dishonor, making their reintegration nearly impossible. Did it encourage reform, or simply create permanent outcasts? For more serious offenses, or for repeat offenders? Physical mutilation, though less common than shaming, could be employed. This might involve the chopping off of a hand for repeated theft, or the blinding of an eye for certain forms of perjury. These were not light punishments. They were meant to be permanent, visible markers of transgression, serving as a constant reminder to the community of the consequences of violating the law. You can almost feel the chill run down your spine at the thought of such a punishment. Brutal and irreversible. Execution, as mentioned before, was rare and reserved for the most heinous crimes, usually those seen as an offense against the entire community or a breach of sacred trust. This included treason, particularly egregious acts of murder not settled by wergild or witchcraft. The methods of execution were often public and symbolic. Hanging was common, sometimes in a manner that emphasized the offender's isolation from society. Drowning, particularly in bogs, was associated with crimes that offended the earth goddesses, or for those deemed to have disturbed the natural order, like certain forms of witchcraft. You might hear tales of bodies found perfectly preserved centuries later in peat bogs, a chilling testament to this ancient form of justice. The brutal nature of these punishments, whether shaming or physical, served a clear purpose: deterrence. In a world without prisons or widespread police forces, the immediate and visible consequences of crime were paramount. The community itself was the enforcer, and the public nature of the punishment served to reaffirm societal norms and the authority of the thing. The punishments were designed not just to hurt the individual, but to scar their reputation, or to remove them from society altogether, ensuring that the message was clear to all who witnessed it. You watch as a man, his face flushed with shame, is led away from the thing, his public disgrace a far heavier burden than any physical chains could be. You realize that in the brutal justice system of the Viking Age, the true power lay in the community's judgment, delivered not always by the swing of an axe, but often by the piercing gaze of public scorn. A punishment that could last long after the physical pain had faded. A permanent mark on one's very soul. As our journey through the brutal justice system of the Viking Age draws to a close, you can now appreciate its profound and lasting impact. This isn't just a collection of fascinating historical tidbits. It's a testament to how early societies grappled with maintaining order, resolving conflict, and defining right from wrong. The legacy foundations of law laid by the Vikings, though often harsh and rooted in different values, profoundly influenced the development of legal systems across Northern Europe, shaping concepts that resonate even in modern jurisprudence. It's like looking at the rough-hewn stones of an ancient building and recognizing the foundational blocks upon which grander, more complex structures were eventually built. You've witnessed the thing, the open-air assembly where common people held surprising power, making decisions and upholding laws. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this legacy is that the concept of popular assemblies, things and customary community-enforced law in the Viking Age, provided a foundational model for early forms of representative governance and legal frameworks in many Northern European countries. Predating more centralized monarchical systems, these assemblies laid the groundwork for later parliamentary and judicial bodies. Consider the notion of wergild, the man payment. While a direct monetary compensation for death or injury might seem archaic, the underlying principle of civil damages and reparations for harm is a cornerstone of modern legal systems. When you hear about financial settlements in court cases today, you're seeing a distant echo of the Viking wergild, a quirky tidbit that reveals the enduring nature of certain legal concepts. Imagine a modern judge ordering someone to pay a finger gild for a broken digit. Historians still argue whether the wergild system's emphasis on restoring peace through compensation, rather than solely on punishment, created a more stable society than one focused purely on retribution, or if it merely highlighted class disparities by valuing lives differently. Did it truly promote peace, or just codify inequality? The emphasis on oaths, on the importance of one's word and reputation, also has a lasting legacy. While we no longer have oath helpers in a formal sense, the credibility of witnesses, the swearing of oaths in court, and the concept of perjury all harken back to a time when a person's solemn vow before their community and perceived higher powers was a fundamental pillar of justice. The very idea of an honorable man or woman whose word could be trusted was paramount then, and remains important now. Even the extreme punishment of outlawry, While brutal reflects a crucial legal concept, the removal of an individual from the protection of the law when they fundamentally threaten the social contract. Modern societies have prisons and other forms of exclusion, but the Viking concept highlighted the ultimate dependence of the individual on the community's acceptance. Your very survival, as you've seen, depended on your place within the community. The thing itself, as a legislative and judicial body, was remarkably democratic for its time. While not everyone had equal power, all free men could attend, speak, and influence decisions. This participatory form of governance contrasted sharply with the emerging feudal monarchies of continental Europe. The Icelandic Althing, for example, founded in 930 AD, is often considered one of the world's oldest surviving parliamentary institutions, a direct descendant of the Viking Age thing. As Christianity began to influence these systems, you saw the slow introduction of written law, more centralized authority, and a shift towards concepts of universal sin and divine forgiveness. This merging of pagan tradition and Christian doctrine eventually led to the more codified, formalized legal systems that would become common in medieval Europe. Combining elements of ancient custom with Roman and ecclesiastical law, you realize that the seemingly brutal and informal justice system of the Vikings was, in its own way, incredibly sophisticated and pragmatic. It was designed for a society without prisons or a centralized state, relying instead on strong community ties, personal honor, and the constant threat of social exclusion or direct retribution. The emphasis on compensation, public shaming, and communal participation formed a robust, if harsh, framework for maintaining order. And so, as the echoes of the law speaker's voice fade, and the clang of the holmgang falls silent, you can see how the seeds of modern legal principles were sown in the windswept lands of the Norse. The brutal justice of the Viking Age, with its focus on honor, communal consent, and a practical approach to conflict resolution, built a foundation upon which much of Western legal thought would eventually stand. Your journey through this ancient legal landscape reveals that even in the most seemingly chaotic times, humanity has always striven for a form of order, a way to define right from wrong, even if that definition was sometimes forged by the cold edge of an axe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The clang of axes and the shouts of the thing are now just distant echoes in the quiet of your room. Let the complexities of Virgil and the weight of ancient oaths drift away, leaving only the calm reassurance of your own comfortable space. The brutal justice of the Viking Age is firmly in the past, a piece of history that now softens into the gentle whispers of sleep. Let your mind unwind, your muscles relax, and sink into a deep, peaceful slumber, safe from the trials of the thing.